Great to have you here, John. Welcome again.
Exciting. Thank you.
Yeah. We met some time ago to talk about this. I read the book. The question, how did I come to read this book? I think somebody thought, oh, it's a business book. Lauri, could you read it? It's a business book. And then I read it and I said, no, it's not a business book. It's an intersection of a business book and technology book. So glad to have you today. We are going to talk about the book, and we are going to be talking about the things in the book. And before we get going, I'd like to share some of my experiences, because I was actually listening to your book much rather than reading the book. I was walking my dog and listening to it from Audible. And strangely, sometimes when I listen to music as I go running, and then I listen to the same piece of music again, I can recall where I was running when I listened to that piece of music last time. And now if I read the book, if I listen to the book again, I can imagine that I remember where I was walking the dog when I heard that passage. I wish it worked the other way around, in that if I think of a location during my course of walking the dog, I could recall everything that you said and wrote in the book. But unfortunately, we don't have this reverse lookup implemented yet. To start with, let's talk about what motivated you to write the book, and what is the sort of vacuum that this book fills. I went online and I searched for DevOps books, and I came across one search result, the title being 47 best books for DevOps. So I think it is a confirmation that there are DevOps books. So what led to you and the folks who contributed to writing this book to do it?
And if I give you the kind of complete backstory, but the name was, it seemed like a great name at the time. And now I think somebody was telling me the other day they were on a plane with the book, and somebody sitting next to them said, because the name of the book is Investments Unlimited, right? Somebody said, well, good luck with that one. I'm like, people think it's an investment advice book, right? But the reason it's called Investments Unlimited was ultimately modeled after the Phoenix Project. And, for those who remember the Phoenix Project, it was Parts Unlimited, right? So we thought, okay, let's tell a Phoenix-like project-like story for an investment bank, Investments Unlimited. But so what happened was, back in 2018, so Gene Kim, who is the founder of IT Revolution, the author of the Phoenix Project, my co-author for the DevOps Handbook, and I've done a couple of books with Gene. We did something called Beyond the Phoenix Project. He invites for almost maybe almost 10 years now, and I think we just finished the 10th year. Where he would invite different people, like 40 or 50 people to Portland to work on these projects. So if you go to IT Revolution, we call them forum papers. There's hundreds of them out there. Incredible resource. Some of the top DevOps people doing the DevOps work, DevSecOps work, in our industry, in different industries, are creating great resources. So I happened to meet a gentleman called Topo Pal at this forum back in 2017. We immediately started talking about, audit, internal audit, the efficacy of audit. We came back the next year in 2018, still like, hey, this is an unsolved problem. There's like low efficacy in audit. There's high toil, 30, 40 day a year. And in 2019, we started talking a little more serious, and we decided to write a paper. And that year, the forum paper was called the DevOps Automated Governance Reference Architecture, which basically was an incredible stellar group of people. I had Courtney Kisser, who at the time was at Nike. I had Sam Guggenheim, who basically ran infrastructure at Microsoft for years. Dwayne Holmes ran massive infrastructure at Marriott. John Razatowski ran all release engineering, owned 3 floors in the PNC Tower in Pittsburgh for his teams. I mean, it's just an incredible group of people. And Topo, of course, Topo Powell, he was at Capital One. He was the first fellow at Capital One. Anyway, so we wrote this, what we thought was this amazing paper that would show you how to create a simple sort of a microservice that would turn into a container that was like get customer ID, and we would force the evidence. By the time you got into the Kubernetes admin controller, we'd put a no-go gate if you didn't collect the evidence. So the idea was we were going to sort of collect evidence, non-human, through the pipeline. That book was incredibly boring. I thought at the end of that book, I thought, man, everybody's going to this is going to be the number one most downloaded book. And it was, it was just, I thought it was great. It still is a great book for like a junior programmer. If you want to understand it had like 75 risk controls in it that was defined. And you had to imagine sitting at the whiteboard. I'm sitting back and just proud that I got all these people in the room. But you got Twain Holmes from Marriott saying, well, we use these type of control gates and attestations here at Marriott. And then John Ralston said, well, we do this at PNC. And Sam Guggenheim, who runs Microsoft, would say, we do this. And Topo Powell be Capital One. And, I'm getting goosebumps listening to this, right? And but it was just rote boring. Fast forward a couple years later, one of the gentlemen that was involved in that project was John Rezatowski. He's at DexCon now, but he was at PNC. He was so excited about that project that he went back and he built a internal product based on this. This idea that you could create subjective evidence, sort of originally just signed data and then basically use some type of control gates based on the things that everybody says they do subjectively in change records. And so I basically was a mentor for that project. I'd show up there, I'd help. I didn't directly develop, and use some consultants and some internal people. But I decided, let's get the band back together in 21 and let's go ahead and do a version 2 of the DevOps automated reference architecture. So we get through the first day. Normally what they do at the forum is you get like 2.5 days to basically wireframe your story. And most of the ones are not books, right? So we were the first one done over a 10-year period that actually turned into a book. And we listened to everybody else's readouts, right, on their books, they were so fascinating and creative. And we're like, you know what, we're creating another boring story again. So we came back next morning and we said, let's turn it into somebody suggests, let's turn it into like a story, a short story. And then I had the idea, like, well, if we're going to do that, let's use the Phoenix Project model, because anybody who's familiar with Phoenix Project, it's actually built on Elliott Gorat's The Goal. There's always this sort of mentor-mentee relationship. There's a core chronic conflict. It's a hero's journey where some bum, the original Alex, Jonah, in the Goal, Bill and Eric in the Phoenix Project. Like there's the sort of the Eric is this sort of floppy guy who never gives you the answer. You're like, tell me the answer. So we tried to create that for a bank, and we can get deeper into the story, but. And that then we just sort of like we hit gold, right? Which we finished it as a short story, someone's maybe a novella. I'm trying not to be fancy. And then like the other thing, we had 9 authors. I'm like, it was never really supposed to be a book. The IT Revolution crew, Gene and the editorial staff, they were like, can you turn this into a book? And I said, let me get the team back. Because you only have a window to do these papers. You got like 3 days. And then you got 2 months, and then we normally publish at DevOps Enterprise Summit. And I said, let's get the team back, and everybody loved the idea. So we spent another about 8 months, and we turned it into a book, and it's actually selling really well. And except for the name, it's as you've read it, it's I think it's I know you have some other questions, but like it's very relevant. It's a story. So again, people who are listening, it is not an advice book for investing. It's a bank that almost loses its banking license, and they have to figure out how to sort of DevOps their way out of it.
Well, in the hindsight, there may be something positive about selecting that kind of a book name where, whoever asked me to have this session somehow got an impression that it's a business book. And it's not that bad idea for business people to read technology books. And Fable is a very approachable format for that. I remember when I was reading a Phoenix Project, Unicorn Project first, and then I carried on to read the DevOps Handbook. And I remember browsing DevOps Handbook and thinking like, why is so many concepts in this book so familiar? Like, why do I feel like I have read DevOps Handbook before? But then it dawned on me that there were so much commonalities between Phoenix Project and DevOps Handbook that sort of created that feeling to me. Now, it's not a DevOps Handbook kind of book in its content. So it's talking about software security and governance. So Should we talk a little bit about what's the current landscape? What's specifically the vacuum in its subject that is not covered by the previous literature?
Yeah, and again, I think it's I think there probably would be an interesting follow-on handbook version of Investments Unlimited. I mean, Investment Unlimited is, if you wanted to compare, it is like the Phoenix Project, except that instead of the Phoenix Project was talking about sort of a Java programmer and a delayed software project that was basically very waterfall, and then they learned how to sort of excuse me for saying they learned how to DevOps, but if you get a better word, let me know. So this is that story now for how we do sort of IT risk and sort of DevSecOps, but more about IT risk. And but yeah, the gap is what really just again started back in for me. One of the things I was fortunate to meet Topo Pal. I was fortunate to meet John Rezatowski. So really, there was a lot of contributors to the book, but the three people who contributed mostly to this idea of this DevOps automated governance is myself, Topo Pal, and then John Rezatowski, who built the system at PNC Bank. The problem that we were recognizing, certainly for me, I was doing these qualitative data analysis where I'd go into banks and I'd interview hundreds of people. I did one top 5 bank where I spent a summer interviewing like 400 people, right? And on all things, and on sort of DevOps, flow, value streams, all those things. But I'd certainly talk to security, risk. And the thing I kept hearing is how terrible as an industry we are, and I say are as in today, it's not fixed, in and how we do our internal audits and to an extent external audits. But to me, the Band-Aid that needs to be applied is internal audit, and it is highly subjective. It is basically somebody basically has a change. They have a change record. They annotate the information in a change record. Very subjective, almost like a telephone game. I'm going to do this, and when this happens, I've done this. So very, in 2023, right? Like this is sort of ridiculous that we're not using sort of automation to build these we call evidence attestational data. And we're not basically using, crypto or some digitally signed evidence. And so those are the two things that Tope and I started talking about is like this, like, again, I say even today, I'll walk into organizations and it's not uncommon for a large bank or, really any highly regulated organization to spend 30 to 40 days on internal audits. Right. Now, like you've seen a lot of companies that want to get FedRAMP, in the U.S. for not just because they have to, because it shows like a lot of SaaS-based companies want to get FedRAMP, the low. And now you got to get audited every 30 days. So, so now if you took you 30 days to do a SOX 2, right. I mean, I'm sorry. Yeah, it took 30, 40 days for one SOX 2 a year. Imagine what it's going to be like. So the point is that, Lauri, which is that we really saw a problem in the industry. And even back, like, again, 2018, 2019, you could see the complexity creep that was happening, not just in technology, but in, GDPR was hitting the stage, that you were going to have all these vectors of complexity. And we were just, the way we were handling internal audit was, humans writing telephone game books in ServiceNow records, or ITSM or Jira, and the evidence of that sprawled all over the place. So highly subjective evidence with incredibly high amounts of toil. And it just seemed like a problem, and I like one thing I'm not that smart, but what I have is really, really smart friends. And so when I have an idea, I can go to a group, well, mostly because I've met these people through Gene's, Gene bringing me into this. I can call these incredible people and say, hey, I've got this idea. What do you think? Topo Powell was the first one. Like I say, he was the first fellow at Capital One. Put that in perspective. And we just sort of realized, and then everybody got on board. Yes. And even today, as I talk about this, you talk about that sort of when you read the handbook. Well, most people, when they read the Phoenix Project, they're like, Gene, how did you sneak into our company? And I think the Investment's Unlimited. In fact, remind me to tell you a story about when we were writing the book and we were halfway done and we made up this fictional story and we interviewed some bank that got cease and desist, and it was the exact story. It was the true life version of what we had written. Wow. It feels like some like cease and desist sounds such an ultimatum that you would rarely come across with them, but it's quite staggering that it actually happened in real life and it's so easy to find. Yeah, no, this was it was Mitsubishi. It's a North American bank. They literally. So again, I was going to say later. I might as well say it now because I'll forget it. If those read the book, right? There's this thing called matters requiring attention and matters requiring immediate attention. Basically, can be given out by the OCC. So we made up a story where this Investors Unlimited had 15 MRAs. And the CEO gets a notification from the OCC, sort of a heads up, hey, you're going to get a MRIA, which is heavy stuff. And when you read the book, that's the sort of call to challenge where things, CEO gets everybody in the room, what are we going to do? Well, we interviewed a bank that this North American, very similar story, except they ignored the MRIA and they literally got a cease and desist. Now, here's the thing. You're right. A lot of one of the things that my banking friends tell me, right? And this is going to sound, I hope this sounds callous because I'm just trying to make a point. If people die in a plane crash, the airline doesn't lose its license to fly. If a patient dies grossly in a hospital, most hospitals don't lose their ability. In a bank, if you lose your banking license, you're not a bank. It's over. Now, and one last point, Lauri, and that is, there are lots of other what they call severe enforcement actions that don't involve actually. Look at speaking of Silicon Valley Bank, but we don't even have to go there. Severe enforcement actions that actually that will sort of restrict you for business. So you can get all sorts of penalties where you may not be able to restrict a certain business. Maybe you can't do investments. Maybe So it isn't always as dire as losing the banking license or cease and desist. There's all sorts of grades. And by the way, not just banks. Look at most regulated industries that can lose, millions, even billions, based on findings from an audit.
Yeah. Thank you for this. We have spent about half of our time, and I promised that we would give time also for questions from the audience. So I'm reminding the people online to please use the Q&A function, and I'd be happy to prefer your questions to John and then take them in and sort of build this interactive track. It's an interactive track. That's what the name says. So I'm going to put out one more question for John, and then while you're working on it, then I'll start to look at the Q&A and see what other questions from the audience is coming up. And my question is related to sort of culture versus tools. So if I sort of deliberately, mistakenly paraphrase Peter Drucker, who says that culture eats tools for breakfast. If you have a poor culture in your if that a software development process or if that anything else, then the tool won't fix it. And then the polar opposite of the opinion is that a tool is a way to embody your culture. So the tool sort of captures your culture and then is a way to facilitate your culture because the tool sets some boundaries or some preconditions for that. So what's your opinion on the role of automation, where we specifically talk about software audit, security, and governance?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we learned in DevOps is, early DevOps. I was one of the pioneers of DevOps. I was the only American at the first DevOps day in Ghent. Me and Damon Edwards and a few other people created, Mark Hinkle, Andrew Clay Schaefer created the first DevOps day in the U.S. And in the early, there was this sort of bravado of like, not egotistical, like we're going to automate everything, we're going to remove the humans, and you quickly learn that like humans are just, instead of removing humans, you take the humans just become an actor in the system, as opposed to the sort of the pilot of the system, right? Mm. That's the big takeaway we learned DevOps. So like, I don't want to make that mistake twice with, audit and IT. So I would like to use tools to automate, and there's two levels of tools. This is a good question, because there's two levels. There's sort of the tool, I'll only take two shameless plugs, but there's a tool like my company I work for now, Cosly.com, which basically gives you the umbrella to fingerprint the digitally signed data for all the things that you say you want to do and create an evidence vault. And then there's the tools that generate all the data. So at high level, we want to automate everything that's possible. But there are human conditions that you will never remove. Like naively, when we wrote that first paper, we thought, and these are really smart people, like we sort of naively implied that you didn't need a change record. Like, no, that was a really bad idea. Change record's going to exist forever. Like, so somebody's going to create a change record. So, but now instead of having all that evidence in the change record, why can't we just make as much as possible automated? And it can be things, they can be like even what I would call soft automation, like, cyclomatic complexity, or there was a review on a pull request, right? And those things. So on tools, one, you need a tool to do the sort of overarching evidence collection and fingerprinting to change that sort of ServiceNow subjective, and I keep using ServiceNow, but any tool that's in your service management portfolio, that can turn that sort of subjective descriptive stuff into objective digitally signed, I call it a fingerprint, and then collect the actual evidence. So you need an overarching tool for that. And then the tools, one of the things I like about this model, even if you go back and read the DevOps automated governance reference architecture, we listed out, and it wasn't really based on recommendation. It was just whoever shouted out first, like SonarQube, Nexus, or like we listed, and those tools, like none of those get replaced, right? So you have, you literally, in fact, what I like about this model, what I liked about it originally was you walk into a shop and say, what's your DevSecOps reference architecture? Great. Let's just overlay. So I call it risk as code, because policy as code gets a little overloaded in our industry. I think too often when people say policy code, they're thinking that we're talking about OPA and the admin control and Kubernetes. So I like to think of it as like risk as control, which may now like it's all these things in the flow of the work, starting even ideation, but certainly commit, and all those things are sort of now become these digitally signed attestations, but all those things can be derived or overlaid on top of all your favorite tools, right? And so this is this beautiful sort of mixture of, in a lot of ways, the automated governance sort of model is relatively simple. I mean, the hard work is what you've been doing, which is I need to make sure I'm using SonarQube, I'm using checkmarks, I'm using, Sysdig. I'm going to just list all my friends' companies, Sneak, right? Like all those are incredibly great products, and I know I'm missing a bunch. JFrog, right? Everything from JFrog is awesome. Yes. Now let me put an overlay on top of that to be able to take the human out of that evidence collection.
Yeah. Super. Thank you for that. Sure. Out of coincidence, my next question is almost the same as Morten's question 2 minutes ago. So my question would have been, what is it that the organizations has to change to include security as part of the DevOps infinity loop? And I know I'm putting out the term there in a provocative way. And Morten is asking, as a developer/architect, how do I get my auditing security department started on a DevOps journey?
Yeah, those are two really good questions. On the first one, the first thing I think is really important, and a lot of times when I'm giving a presentation in front of a big room, I'll say something like if you think I'm an idiot, if you think like this guy's just a bunch of blowhard noise, like all I want for you to do is one takeaway. Just give me one takeaway. I know people like what I say, but if everything you thought I said was nonsense, please just give me this one thing, which is IT sec is not IT risk. And that people are like, well, no, it's not obvious to our industry. Your DevSecOps reference architecture, your IT security, all those things are absolutely necessary and important to focus on. So like the development relationship with sort of DevSecOps or IT sec, right? That's an important relationship, right? And there's a lot of great presentations that I've done and people smarter than me have done on DevSecOps. And you can look at DevSecOps reference architecture. It has to happen. But you are not solving a critical problem if you're just focusing on IT sec and not IT. Because basically, when we get into IT risk, what we're talking about is a group of people that first and foremost are there to protect the brand. I love the IIA, the Industry Internal Audit Association, basically Institute of Internal Audits. They call it 3 lines of defense, right? Like the first line is the sort of implementer, what we would think about as the developer or the DevSecOps or operations relationship of the thing you'd have to do. Maybe you'd put check marks or sneak in, right? And then the second line is this sort of bridge of the person who helps own that risk, but sort of translates that risk to the third line, which is internal audit. Here's the thing. IT sec is not IT risk, because IT risk is the second line and third line. And what do they do first and foremost? They protect the brand. So you might be nominally or notionally protecting the brand, and I mean this with all respect, by building a Sistine Chapel of a DevSecOps reference architecture. But unless you have people who are focused at a commitment level to the business and beyond, the board of operations, things that go way heavier into like how the company operates and how it gets externally audited, unless you're having a pure dialogue with those people, which most people are not, then you really, in a lot of ways, this is sound cows, but you're getting lucky if you're protecting your systems. And it really is, like, to me, it was the light bulb finally went off when I started talking to a lot of second line people in our industry, and they would basically tell me the horror stories. Like you could I want to do more interviews with second line people in banks, because it's like they talk, the stories they tell you, how they're disconnected. Like you literally, we solved the DevOps problem, right? DevOps. We solved the DevSecOps problem, Dev security operations. In my opinion, we're not even close to solving the sort of, and I don't want to create a new word. I didn't really like the last time we morphed DevOps to DevSecOps, but it was necessary. But we have not solved that sort of first line, which is all our DevOps, DevSecOps brethren, to IT risk, second line and third line, if that makes sense.
Yeah. How much do you think there is? Everybody understands it when I say management resistance. But if I try to flip it in a positive sense, that, okay, now we know what must be done. We also know how it should not be done. Mm-hmm. Then the question follows is, if you are an architect or running a platform team or working in an IT sec or a risk, how do you secure the management buy-in so that you get what you need to invest in the audit and governance process in a way that it is effective and you don't get into this tug of war between compliance versus release velocity?
No, this goes back to I think the second part of that question, which was part yours, part Martin's, right? Which is like, how do I, as a developer, and I think this is the same question that you're asking here. The thing that look, if I go back to the DevOps, right? Like there was this sort of Andrew Clay Schaefer built the wall of confusion. You had Dev on one side, Ops on one side, and this sort of caricature of the Dev would throw their code over the wall, Ops would catch it. They'd yell back at him and say, "Hey, like that didn't work," and like, "No, you broke it," right? Like, and so what did we do? We atom smashed those. To basically have to communicate. We created all this sort of reference and intellectual property and thought leadership around like how do we get Dev and Ops together? And then we started this DevSecOps thing. Same thing. How can we get ITSec in the same room? So the answer is, and there's evidence that when people implement these sort of automated, we'll just call it DevOps automated reference architecture or DAG, you start seeing this tighter collaboration from risk and developers and operations. So imagine you have a risk as code as a DSL. So instead of just telling the operations, basically what happens, right? The second level tell operations, hey, you must have all these things in a pipeline. So the operations, it's the worst telephone game possible. Second line says you must do all these things, and they're very vague, right? Well, why? Because PSI DSS, because DORA, because FedRAMP, whatever. And so the operations people say, okay, well, I think what we'll do is we'll just gate it if this product says it doesn't do that. Right? Like if Sneak or Checkmark says it doesn't. So then the developer's like not even in the story, and then their build breaks and they're like, well, what happened? Oh, well, we had this OWASP check top 10 and you had an SQL injection. They're like, no, I don't even do any database calls in my program. Like, why'd you do that? Like, yeah, because there was some dependency and like that's how the system works. As opposed to some type of overarching solution that can be driven through a DSL, like a risk as code, and where like second line can sit in that meeting with operations and developers and say, hey, I'm going to need you to have this corresponding DSL in your in the repo for this project. And now you can have a conversation. Like, what does that actually mean? Well, it means this, and you can create exceptions. But the real key point is you're getting those people in design and requirements. It's what we did sort of with Dev and Ops. And here's the one thing, Lauri, that I think is sort of beautiful, and I've seen this. What happens is when you build these kind of systems, and the evidence I've seen in some organizations do this, is you move away from sort of a conflicting developers dev and ops trying to hide things from auditors, like, oh, we don't tell auditors things they don't already know, right? Or we'll use this fake screen print that we've been using for 4 years, right? When you start seeing everybody collaborate, you actually see, I've seen this on a dashboard, what's called self-identified risk, where developers now start coming up with more creative ways to protect the brand, because now they're buying in and they're seeing like all this. They got a dashboard, and like when they get a red, like break the build or sort of a gate, if you will, they can literally click it and go back to the risk as code that they already agreed with. Right? Like, so now you've just cleared up a lot. I mean, again, it's still not going to be easy. It's still going to be a lot of confusion, but like we put a layer in place that at least forces us all to have conversations, because we're just not having conversations with risk, in my opinion, in almost all the companies I visit. So that's how you get, like, that's one attack vector. And then the second attack vector then is, I mean, it really, at some point, Patrick DeBar said to me once, so like, my dear friend, the godfather of DevOps, like he said something like, John, in a perfect world, you can spend 0 on risk and have no attacks. Like, nobody would do that. But like, I think there's always the leadership arbitrage in their head about like how much do they pay for risk versus, and like, it's a dangerous game, and it gets dangerous, with some of them, like I said, they're, the world has got smarter than just checkbox auditing. And so, like, I think, the level that C-level people have to start understanding is it is about collaborative effort to protect the brand. That's first and foremost. Yeah. So what are the cool services that you encountered in this space. I think I think so one of the things that like I'm seeing more and more is this idea of an evidence vault, and we're sort of using this. Here's the thing, right? Like it's not just audit, right? It's also incident, of course, right? Like so one of the things that that we know, I've said this a bunch of times, is the change is the DevOps heuristic, right? And what I mean by that, so if you look at the SRE book, if you look at Gene Kim's original book on incident, if you look at John Osbar, if you like his master's thesis on what he did at incident at Etsy, it always, the first heuristic is if there's an incident, if there's a problem, an incident, it's most likely the last change. And when we think about audit, it's always, not always, but primarily audits go back to, I want to see the evidence for this change. So then the heuristic is change for incident and audit. Then the thing that what you really want to do is make sure that last change is one click away. Right. So again, this overarching pattern, I'm collecting everything on every change, all the sort of attestations of that change. And I want to be able to, in an incident for a developer or operations or SRE, platform engineering, to get one click to the last change of my suspect. If we go by the heuristic that the last change is most likely the culprit. And then here's where it sort of breaks down is that what anybody really needs to do if they're doing incident management is they need to see the real evidence. So like I want to see the commit log. I want to see the build log. I want to see the sneak log for the vulnerability scan. I want to see all that stuff, right? So what the kind of systems that I've been seeing and we're building at Costly is that's the second click. And here's the really important point is that second click of the evidence, that's signed as well. It's archived and signed. Because today, even if you have an evidence system that's fingerprinted, which most people don't, the next step is I've got to go find that log. And mostly today, all that's operational data, right? And so now the problem that you run into is one, because it's operational data, it may, depending on the classification, it may be logs were rotated. Somebody might rename the directory. There might be directory permissions. Right? There could be all these things that could get in the way of that change heuristic for audit or incident. And then second, like if you look at SolarWinds, I was brought in to do some analysis of SolarWinds breach. They mutated logs. So really clever adversaries. So if you're using operational logs, and these adversaries are beyond incredibly talented. Yeah. Like they literally not only change things, they go mutate and delete records out of logs. So that second click is an archive version, and then what we call it is a tamper evident model. So the fingerprint that said there was a vulnerability scan, or there was image signing, the classic one, like in the SolarWinds, right? The image was signed, right? Yep. Because that was one of the things that the MITRE ATT&CK framework or CrowdStrike did their analysis at and said, like, they literally, if they were signing images, there was a good chance they were going to catch it because they mutated the compiler, basically, right? But so here's the thing: like, if you have this two-step process with an evidence vault. If you were to look at the log from like Tough and Notary or something like that, like the minute you brought it up, it would tell you that that's been tampered with because the signed artifact, the sort of the tarred and shard actual evidence is signed to the fingerprint.
Yep.
And, so that I think that's like this idea of using. Sort of crypto. I heard somebody recently tell me a story where large, big organization that everybody knows and uses, they fingerprint all their microservices, and then they fingerprint or they do a SHA of all those SHAs, and that's how they control rollback or roll forward releases. Right, so it's this like beautiful idea, and like I know you would ask something like we've been playing around with a relatively new product called SigStar, right, which was originally built for certificate transparency, but it has this beautiful. It's a Merkle tree, basically. Right? So there's so much that we can be doing with, just loosely say crypto, that can make us so much more efficient than sort of these manual collecting the data. Like if we could just SHA things and create Merkle trees, and like we could take so much of the toil out of the process. So anyway.
And if it was 2022, we would mention a blockchain here, right? But because it's 2023.
Well, interesting enough, the first conversation I had with Topo Pal was, could we use blockchain to solve this? And I think our journey found out that, I always say, think blockchain, don't use blockchain, right? And that's what Merkle tree model has always been. And some people argue Merkle tree is a blockchain. I'm like, keep me out of that argument. I want no part of that. But the point being that Merkle tree works brilliantly for this kind of, and it really has all the properties of blockchain. So if I go back to the starting of the conversation, this is called Investments Unlimited, which is equivalent in its abstraction to Phoenix Project, Unicorn Project. So I believe we are looking forward to the day when we will see software audit handbook or whatever would be the equivalent of it. Well, hint. We actually 2 weeks ago we were all in Portland and we were writing we don't know if they'll want to turn it into a book, but it's going to be Investments Unlimited 2. Hint, they get bought out by a much larger bank. And then we're writing a story about the little bank, what the big bank learns from the little bank. So anyway, by the way, reach out to me if you have good stories. This is something we didn't do last time. So if you've got like big company learning from little company learning from big company stories, like please reach out. I think it's going to be I think it will be a book, but we'll see.
Yeah, we'll definitely voice that out. Now, I want to thank you for the time you took with us. This was absolutely fascinating conversation, and I can personally recommend everybody read or listen to the book. If even whether you have a dog or not, you still make a lot of use of that book. So thanks, John, for your time, and I hand back to Julia.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thank you so much. Great to have you here.
Hi, we're from Eficode, and we're delighted to organize the DevOps conference.
The interactive track at our conference has a unique opportunity for speakers and audience members to engage in dynamic conversations. It fostered a collaborative learning environment. Our tailored coaching services can also help you to overcome challenges in your software development life cycle. Let's have a chat.
Connect with us at eficode.com and let's push the boundaries of software development.